you're pretty upbeat about the silver sector. That's pretty much your focus.
That's
anything
right.
and everything silver. So this is kind of a open-ended question, but what is a true ounce of silver really worth, in your opinion?
So that's really an interesting question, and I had a funny anecdote kind of for that. A day ago, a mining executive had asked me, I had my book available. I just wrote a book called The Great Silver Bull, and I had my book available, and he said, well, this looks interesting. How much is the book? And I said, well, it's $30 on Amazon. And he said, well, would you take an ounce of silver for it in exchange? And it's funny because I hadn't thought about that. And I thought, absolutely. If you have to go to a dealer today and buy an ounce of silver, it's going to set you back $35 Canadian with current premiums, roughly.
Right.
And so I thought, that's a great deal for me. I'll do that all day long. How many do you want? Right? And obviously for him, it was worth it. He feels like he's getting a lot of value for that ounce of silver. And so it really comes down to, personal interpretation. And the market tells you it's $22 spot for an ounce of silver. You have to go to a dealer and buy an ounce, a Canadian silver maple leaf, for example, and you're going to pay $35.
Right.
So premiums are crazy. Supply seems to be tight. And so it's really a matter of interpretation. I think, though, that over time, the premiums will come down and the spot price will rise to approach. They'll never obviously match the price for physical silver because so many other things go into producing an ounce of silver versus having to buy say 1,000-ounce bar where you're going to get more silver per ounce, per dollar.
Right.
But I think spot prices will rise and catch up to physical prices.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Well, you've seen so much speculative investing over the last several years. I guess for anybody to invest in silver or bullion itself, you have to, you got to be a fundamental investor, right? For the right reasons. So, over the last few years, ever since the pandemic, you've seen a lot of speculative investing in NFTs, EFTs, pretty much any category that has a lot of liquidity, liquid assets.
Exactly.
So, this is an interesting question here, is with silver being a non-bearing interest asset class, and it's very, very volatile, why would anybody even want to think of even getting exposure to silver?
Well, that's an interesting point because if you're talking about volatility and NFTs, it's hard to get much more volatile than NFTs or crypto, for example, which NFTs obviously are related to. And so if people have appetite for volatility, silver's a place where they'll find it.
Right.
However, it's true that it does tend to go through long periods of being very quiet, and then exploding.
Right.
And sometimes I'm going to say perhaps relatively unexpectedly.
Right.
And so if people want to benefit from that, they have to learn patience, which I know today is very difficult with instant gratification of all sorts. But silver will pay off. It's proven itself over decades, centuries, even millennia, to protect your wealth, especially in the kind of inflationary environment that we have today.
I was just going to talk about the inflationary environment, because we have significant persistent inflation that just keeps getting out of control worldwide. I mean, it's when it was driven by the U.S. Fed policy, and everybody kind of follows from that.
Exactly.
And now you're talking about stagflationary risks. This morning now I was reading about even a deflationary risk eventually. So where are we at? And does this favor silver in a way, or does not? Like, what's your opinion on that?
The 70s was a stagflationary environment. You had economic stagnation and you had price inflation. So silver did very well. It's the best analog that we have. It goes back 50 years, but still we had a decade-long run over that time period in silver. Silver did 37 times return, 3,700% return.
Yeah.
So silver performs well in those environments, and I think even if you have economic slow, the interesting thing about silver is that it's a two-sided metal. It's got an industrial component and it's got a wealth protection, sort of inflation protection component.
Right.
And so it has the potential to perform well in either environment.
In either environment.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Okay. So what are some of the material uses for silver? Because we see the general uses that the general public may or may not know about. But what are some unique uses of silver recently that you know about that are quite innovative? For example, talking about this electrification future where all you hear about is battery metals.
Exactly.
You know, copper, cobalt, whatever. But not many people know that obviously silver as well is a big component
Absolutely.
of that.
Right.
But yeah, what are some material uses?
Well, I think it's important for people to know if they are interested in looking at silver that the single biggest use for silver of any of the industrial side is solar. 11% of all the silver supply every year goes to just the solar industry to make solar panels.
Right.
And that's growing at double-digit rates every year. The consumption of silver from solar. So it's interesting that the International Energy Agency has projected that by 2030, the electrical output from solar panels should be up 8.5 times.
Wow.
It right now represents about 3% of global electricity. If it goes up by 8.5 times, and it currently soaks up 11% of the annual supply of silver, that would mean, according to those projections, that silver from solar would soak up almost the entire annual supply of silver.
Unbelievable.
So exactly. I mean,
okay.
Needless to say, that's not going to happen. The projections are too aggressive. But what it does suggest is that silver prices need to rise a lot because that kind of demand, and we haven't even factored the rest of industrial demand, we haven't factored in investment demand.
Yeah.
And investment demand tends to be the wild card that tends to, when people feel like they're missing out, when they see the silver price start to rise, and gold in particular, because gold will go first.
Right.
Then they feel if they see gold at say $2,500 or something that's an outlier and it has run to that level, they'll look for an alternative. They'll feel like gold is perhaps too expensive for them at that point. They'll look for an alternative, and silver is that natural alternative to gold.
Interesting. Well, talking about silver, where does silver even come from? You have the primary silver producers, and you have silver that is produced as a byproduct, as part of the main operation of whatever mine that's out there. So, do you know what the split is between both?
Right.
And that can maybe talk to the scarcity or not of silver.
So that's interesting because it brings up some interesting dynamics. 25% only of all of the silver mined comes from primary silver mines.
25%.
25%. The rest of the silver that comes from mining actually comes from mining other metals.
Interesting.
So it's a byproduct of gold, of copper, of lead, and of zinc mining.
Right.
And so the dynamic is that these miners that produce the other metals, they'll tend to look at it as an additional revenue, but not as their focus.
Right.
So if the silver price goes up, as it is, it's hard to try to crank up a mine. Mines are big, complicated operations, capital intensive.
Right.
And so even just to try to expand a mine is difficult. And if you're trying to do it because you see one of your byproduct prices go up, it's just unlikely that they're going to react. So rather than try to react, they'll just accept the higher price.
Right.
And it's not a normal economic response where you try to produce more of something when the price goes up. They just don't have that kind of flexibility. So the higher price, it's interesting with silver and gold, in fact, because often what happens is when the price starts to go up, rather than people buying less, people tend to want to buy more because they get excited about it, and it tends to run even farther.
It drives that momentum in the market.
Exactly.
For sure. Yeah.
And with that price rising, and the mine's not producing any more of it necessarily, the price goes up, the output might stay the same, and so that just kind of feeds on itself and helps the price to move even higher, even more.
And I guess also, maybe this may not be true, but like with primary silver producers, I mean, their main focus is silver, so they're, really want to get as much high grade as possible out of the ground. True. Whereas a secondary silver producer, where you get byproducts, I mean, the grade is not really of importance.
Right.
So it kind of speaks to the scarcity of new discoveries or such. So that could affect as well. I don't know.
Absolutely. And so there's another interesting sort of aspect to look at is that mining executives tend to be relatively conservative, and they're price takers. They don't decide the price of the commodity. All they can do is control their costs.
Yeah.
So, if some of them, even perhaps some of the primary silver producers, they see the price go up, and they need to be convinced that it's going to stay up.
Right.
So sometimes it needs to rise and stay higher for as much as a year or a couple of years before they even think of making changes to their operations. some of the changes might actually be to start, under the scenario of a higher silver price, to actually start looking to mine lower grade ore because they can maintain their profits,
Right.
mine lower grades, and actually perhaps produce less silver under a higher silver price.
Right. Yeah.
So a higher silver price might actually lead to lower silver output.
Interesting.
Which sounds completely backwards,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
from the perspective of a miner, it makes absolute sense.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about your silver book. You've been holding it. We mentioned earlier. So you've been quite busy during the pandemic writing this book. So I had a lot of thought process. So talk about it. Let's hear about the Great Silver Bull.
That's right. So needless to say, it's all about silver. I talk about the history of silver. I talk about why it's important today.
Okay.
And I look at the supply and demand dynamics and how silver has become irreplaceable in a lot of applications. Mm-hmm. And then I talk about what makes the silver market move. A lot of it will be sentiment. A lot of it will be, again, as I say, the supply-demand dynamics.
Right.
And it's a quirky kind of metal. We talked a little bit before about how the mining industry will react to higher prices.
Right. Yeah.
And ultimately, I talk about how to build an investment portfolio in silver. Mm-hmm. The different options you have, everything from physical silver all the way down to the junior explorers.
Right.
I talk about how I would build that portfolio and how you can adjust for risk. Silver is volatile. The stocks are also very volatile, or can be.
Yeah.
And ultimately, when silver runs, you're going to want to take profits. So I talk a little bit about that as well in terms of what kind of indicators you want to look for a potential peak in the silver price, and when and how you'd want to go about selling your silver investments to ultimately cash in.
Interesting. Well, it sounds like a really good book, a really good read. Where can someone look to get it?
Easily. Just go to Amazon and type in The Great Silver Bull and you'll find it there. It's available in paperback and in Kindle.
Actually, great. Okay, well, gold's at around 1840 this morning.
That's right.
Silver around 21 or something. So let's hope for the best. And thanks, Peter, again. Really appreciate for being on. And if you want to have some more questions for Peter, feel free to visit his website. I'll have the description below. And you can ask him, get in touch with him directly and ask any questions. Thank you.